Worship was about to begin in the church where I grew up, and I sat in the pew feeling miserable. I was only 22, but I already felt like a failure at life. I was struggling with what I was supposed to be doing with my life, and while I wasn't yet ready to even own the question, my sexual orientation as well. And with the hindsight that comes with another couple decades of life, I recognize that trying to sort out one's vocation and identity are perfectly normal struggles for a 22-year-old. And that figuring these things out is actually, in fact, a process anyways, not something you ever achieve. And while I know now more about who I am and what kinds of gifts I have to offer in the world, I've also come to expect that I'll be learning new things about myself and about what God is calling me to do until I draw my last breath, and possibly even after that. But that day, I thought that everyone else knew who they were and what they were going to be doing with their life, and I was the only one who could not figure this out. Just as the service was starting, a child crawled into the pew beside me, tapped me on the arm, and whispered loudly in my ear, in the way of 5-year-olds whose whispers can be heard halfway across the room, "You seem sad today. I'll sit with you." That day, that fidgety 5-year-old who very quickly had me out of that pew and to the activity table at the back where people could color, that 5-year-old was God for me. I have absolutely no clue what the minister said that day, but I still remember that feeling of being seen and cared for that young child offered me in the midst of my inner confusion. The purpose of the church is multifaceted, but I think one key part of our collective work is just what that child did that day, to embody God for one another. Ronald Rolheiser tells a story in his book, The Holy Longing, about a little girl who wakes up frightened in the middle of the night. She runs to her parents' room and they comfort her. Then her mom takes her by the hand and leads her back to her bed. And sitting down beside the child on the side of the bed, the mother softly says, "Sweetheart, you know that you do not need to be afraid. You are never alone. God is always with you." To which the child replies, "Yes, Mom, I know that God is always with me, but right now I need someone with skin on." The church is the place we come when we need God with skin on. And the church is the place where we learn how to be God with skin on for one another. I don't remember my own baptism. I was only about 4 months old at the time. Still, I'm pretty sure my parents would have told me if there was a giant dove or a voice from heaven declaring that I was God's beloved. And over my years in ministry, I have had the privilege to baptize many babies and a few older children and adults as well. And I've never heard a voice from heaven in the literal sense, and there's never been doves in the sanctuary, although we did have a bird the one time. Yet, I also know that I have heard that voice from heaven many times over the years, for myself and for others through the shared community of the church. It doesn't always happen at baptism. Sometimes it happens at funerals. Sometimes it happens at weddings. Sometimes it happens in ordinary, everyday worship services. Sometimes it happens at coffee downstairs. But when we are at our best, we remind one another that each and every one of us is God's beloved, and God is well pleased with you and 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 you. That's the promise we proclaim at baptism. It's the truth we remember to give us hope and strength at funerals. When we remember who we are as the church, it's also at the core of how we treat one another each and every day, all through the years. Each of us is God's beloved and worthy of respect and honor as a sacred child of God. This belovedness is our foundational identity. No matter what names the world calls us, no matter what mistakes we make, no matter what difficulties we encounter, through it all, always, forever, we are God's beloved. Sadly, perhaps, being God's beloved children doesn't save us from struggles or difficulties. In fact, I asked Jennifer to read a verse today that is usually left out when the lectionary tells this version of the baptism of Jesus, because it doesn't seem like it's part of the story at all. John is busy preaching in the desert and baptizing people who come to him, telling them that Jesus is coming and he's going to help make everything right for them by the power of the Holy Spirit. Then right in the middle of the story about baptism, between that preaching and the baptism of Jesus, we hear that King Herod has imprisoned John the Baptist in retaliation for John's criticism of Herod's relationship with his sister-in-law. And this part of the story might seem like it doesn't belong, yet perhaps it belongs more than we would care to admit. Because we know that baptism is not a guarantee that our lives will be free from sorrow or pain. Rather, it's about God's promise to be with us through it all. God doesn't keep John out of prison. God doesn't keep Jesus off the cross. But God is with them in the midst of it all. One final story about how remembering that we are God's beloved children can change our lives. In his book, Craddock Stories, celebrated preacher Fred Craddock tells of an evening when he and his wife were eating dinner in a little restaurant in the Smoky Mountains of the United States. A strange and elderly man came over to their table and introduced himself. "I am from around these parts," he said. "My mother was not married, and the shame the community directed towards her was also directed toward me. Whenever I went to town with my mother, I could see people staring at us, making guesses about who my daddy was. At school, I ate lunch alone. In my early teen years, I began attending a little church, but I always left before church was over because I was afraid somebody would ask me what a boy like me was doing in church. One day, before I could escape, I felt a hand on my shoulder. It was the minister. He looked closely at my face. I knew that he too was trying to guess who my father was. 'Well, boy, you are a child of—' And then he paused. When he spoke again, he said, 'Boy, you are a child of God. I see a striking resemblance.' Then he swatted me on the bottom and said, 'Now you go on and claim your inheritance.' I left that day a different person," the now elderly man said. "In fact, that was the beginning of my life." Baptism doesn't create God's love for us. That's always been there. But it does help us to remember and cherish it. And remembering that you are God's beloved can change your life. So go and claim your inheritance. Thanks be to God.